Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am Brian Ritter. I'm the Executive Director for the Mercury Chamber Orchestra, and welcome to our virtual pre-concert talk with Greg Barnett from the Shepherd School of Music at Rice University. We're very, very excited for tomorrow evening's concert on March 27th at 8 p.m. Live at the Wortham Center. And this concert features a curated program by concertmaster and co-founder of Mercury, Jonathan Godfrey. And so it's a great pleasure to turn things over to Greg to give us some musical insights into this very diverse program. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome all. In order to illustrate my remarks, I will share my screen and show you some PowerPoint slides. Starting with a listing of the pieces on the program. And this listing of pieces on the program had me thinking more about suites than I've done in a while, because the suite is something I'm used to from my own area of expertise as a genre of Baroque music, but it has an afterlife or a revival in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And 3 of the 4 pieces represented here come from that period, the revival period of the suite. And then the argument that I made in the program notes is that the Goldberg variations, the exception here, exceptional in that it comes from the Baroque era and that it is not a suite, it's a set of variations. But the argument that I made is that the Goldberg variations have suite-like qualities that fit very nicely into the larger program. But the larger program has me thinking about suites. So I want to devote my beginning remarks to the genre of the suite itself. And you can go back to the 16th century to find composers pairing dances, or sometimes more than just pairing them, maybe stringing several dances together and relating them usually by key or tonality, sometimes also by motif. That is, there will be an opening motto that occurs in all of the contrasted dances, whether it's 2 or more of them. And as I say, that habit goes back to the 16th century. But in order to find the word suite and a definition, you have to go forward in time to the 17th century. And I found one, Thomas Mace, Music's Monument, which in describing different kinds of music or different genres, gives us an early definition of the suite along with the use of that word. He says set or suite of lessons, lessons being pieces or movements. And what you see there, actually, I can show you the passage that I'm drawing on. There we go. Whoops. Okay. The set or suite of lessons. And what he says specifically is that the opening movement is in the nature of a voluntary, and it's usually called a prelude or a preludium. A voluntary is an improvised piece, and oftentimes preludes were considered to be improvised. So anything goes for the opening movement, the opening improvisatory movement. But then after that, it's a series of dances. It's a series of courtly dances. These given in the English spelling, the Almain, air, Coranto, saraband, toy. That is the Allemande, aria or air, courant, saraband, and gigue. The toy is similar to the gigue or jig. So an opening improvisation, and then a series of courtly dances. And that is the definition of the Baroque era suite. And what I'm showing you on the left-hand side of the screen is a series of pieces, in no way comprehensive, but a series of pieces from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that are called suite, to show the later vogue, the Romantic and 20th century vogue for this genre. And the three pieces on the program from this period fit right into this vogue. Now, I'm starting with the Grieg Holberg suite, not because it comes first, but rather because it is the most historical in nature, or most historicist. That is, if you look at the movement types of the Grieg Holberg suite, he is most faithful to the definitions and the practices that we see from the Baroque era. He has an historical perspective in creating the Holberg suite, because what he's doing is he is honoring the great literary figure, Holberg, with music from the time of Holberg. Holberg was born in 1684, so he is a literary figure from the 18th century. And Grieg's method of honoring him is to choose a genre and movement types from Holberg's own time. And you'll note from the title page of this edition that originally Grieg wrote this for piano, and then he made a string orchestra arrangement. But the movement types themselves are prelude and a series of dances, including the air or aria. Now, there are other ingredients to take into account here. For instance, in addition to the historicist inspiration, there is also what we would describe as either a nationalist or a folklorist inspiration at work in the Romantic and early 20th century cultivation of the Baroque suite. And my example comes from a piece that is not on the program, Antonin Dvorak's Czech suite, from a few years earlier than Grieg's. But if you look at the movement titles, you see the familiar prelude opening movement. However, the movements that follow, three of the four following movements are Slavic dances: the polka, the sozetska, the furiant finale. Those three are characteristic Slavic European dances. In fact, Dvorak made his name, internationally anyway, writing collections of Slavic dances for orchestra. Well, this is another example, but one actually called suite. So historical or national or regional perspectives are inspiring these suite collections. And I've got a few more examples. Well, there's Holst, and Holst is an interesting case because on the one hand, he's using the term suite. On the other, which would presume an historical perspective. On the other hand, the choice of the jig, and then more than that, the finale and its inclusion of the Dargeson, which is an English folk tune, but also the addition of Greensleeves, which is another traditional folk tune. It's not exclusive to the British Isles, but it was very popular in the British Isles. What this is telling us is there is both an historical perspective, but also a kind of nationalist or folklorist perspective at work in Holst's St. Paul's suite. And I could just multiply examples. So I've got two more. Glazunov, he's not on the program, but his inclusion of that Oriental movement made me think of one further influence that I just have to mention, which is the character piece influence. That is, in the Romantic era, the composition of character pieces, and usually the assembly of character pieces into a larger collection. Well, that impulse comes from a composer and a piece that don't use the word suite, but nonetheless are drawing on the Baroque suite influence. I'm talking about Robert Schumann's Carnival, which typically, when we teach this piece in music history, we describe it as a collection of character pieces, that is, individual portraits of people. In fact, in this case, individual portraits of people known to the composer. It is the musical representation, in a way, of a circle of friends in their individual musical portraits. But notice the opening movement, the preamble, that is the prelude or preambulum, that comes out of the Baroque suite. The inclusion of dance movements, there's one there, the Valse Noble. That is, again, the DNA of the Baroque dance suite. Now, let me repeat that Schumann himself didn't use the term suite, but I'm arguing the influence is there. And more important, the significance of Schumann's piece in 19th century composition is probably another inspiration at work on that long list of composers on the left side of the screen. Now, there's one more thing for those of you who know Schumann's Carnival. I've only included half a dozen of the 20-odd movements of this piece. So it is more 19th century series of character pieces than traditional Baroque suite in its inclusion of 20 different movements. Nonetheless, I'd argue that the influence is there, and it is vital to the later cultivation of the suite by late 19th century and 20th century composers. Let me also repeat that my list, it's not comprehensive. I just ran out of room on a single slide, and I actually agonized over whether I should make a smaller font and just show you more pieces to show you how popular the suite became in its reincarnation. But I left it where I did. So this is to say that you can find more examples, many more examples of the suite in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Now I want to make a pivot to the Goldberg variations, the piece that stands apart because it's the one piece that belongs to the 18th century, the actual Baroque era, and it's also not a suite. But as I said in the program notes and at the beginning of my remarks, there are characteristics of the Goldberg variations that make it suite-like. And just to repeat that argument, the suite, as you know, stands apart from the sonata or any series of abstract movements, because the movements of the suite itself are either portraits or genres that are recognizable in their own right. So that you often get, as we saw in the earlier slides, a series of titles within the suite. The suite is the generic collection, but then the movements themselves are themselves genres, either dance types or more exotic movement titles, even portraits. So that's distinct from a sonata, for instance, which usually introduces a series of movements that I described as abstract. And what I mean by that is that the sonata movements are described only by tempo indications, andante, allegro, presto. So they are abstract types, distinct from the genre types that you'll get in the suite. So the connection then to the Goldberg variations is that the Goldberg variations is littered with genre types. That is, the individual variations, and there are 30 of these things. It's an aria and then 30 variations. Many of the individual variations are genre types, like a fugue or a gigue. And this is the basis for my argument that's in which, pulling out these genre types, you can assemble a suite out of the Goldberg variations. Now, about the Goldberg variations themselves, the portrait that you're looking at is the Russian ambassador who was afflicted either with an illness or insomnia that inspired Bach to write a series of pieces that Kaiserlink's, this ambassador's servant, could play for him at night in order to soothe his spirit. The servant is down at the bottom, Johann Gottlieb Goldberg. Now, notice that Goldberg was born in 1727, so that at the time of at least the publication of the Goldberg variations, which was 1741, Goldberg would have been very young indeed. He would have been a 14-year-old. But we can imagine a precocious 14-year-old keyboardist, the servant of this Russian ambassador, playing these variations at night for the pleasure and to soothe the spirit of the insomniac or ill Count Kaiserling, the ambassador. Now, I'm pitching it to you in this way, that is, with a voice full of doubt, because the only source for this story of the Goldberg variations originating as a kind of musical medicine for the ailing ambassador, the only source for this is also at the bottom of the slide. Johann Nicholas Forkel, an early biographer of Bach, and he's writing in 1802. So about 60 years after the fact, Forkel has this story, and he doesn't provide any contemporary evidence or testimony. All we've got is Forkel's story, but it's a nice story. So I can't attest to the authenticity. Instead, what I can show you is the original print. Now, this original print comes from a distinctive period in Bach's life, the 1730s and early 1740s. Now, remember, Bach was born in 1685. So by the time he arrives at middle age, he turns to a new musical project. And that new musical project is the publication of a series of volumes devoted to keyboard music. Each one is called Klavierübung, as this one is. And it's 4 volumes of Klavierübungen that come out between the early 1730s and the early 1740s. 4 volumes of keyboard music. And it represents a period in Bach's life when he is turning away from composing for his daily or weekly duties as the Thomaskantor, that is the head of music at Leipzig churches, which he's been doing since 1723. He turns away from furnishing music for those sort of weekly or quotidian duties, and instead starts working on compositional projects to sort of please himself. And this is one of those compositional projects, the Klavierübung volumes. And the Goldberg Variations is the last of those 4 volumes. And what I'm showing you is a translation of the title, Keyboard Practice. And in this case, the keyboard practice comprises an aria with diverse variations for a harpsichord with 2 manuals. And then he adds, and this is composed for music lovers to refresh their spirits. Well, I'm giving you this information, especially the composed for music lovers to refresh their spirits, because scholars have been trying to detect the inspiration for the Goldberg Variations, that is, outside of the story that Forkel provides for us, that gives us the name, the Goldberg Variations. And it just so happens that a few years before Bach's publication was Domenico Scarlatti's publication, what he called esercizi, exercises for the harpsichord. It's very close to Klavierübung. So on the one hand, Scarlatti has been seeing Bach publishing a series of volumes called Klavierübung, and Scarlatti responds in his native language with his own Klavierübung, esercizi per clavicembalo. But note, I'm quoting some of the dedication. Actually, it's not the dedication, it's the note to the reader. The note to the reader, which says, look, I'm not intending anything profound, but rather an ingenious jesting with art. And more than that, if you look at the title page of the original publication, you see this motto on the front, relief from cares. And this has had scholars thinking that perhaps in their musical prints of keyboard music, Bach and Scarlatti are in some kind of dialogue, first with the title, Exercises for the Keyboard, or Exercises for the Harpsichord. And then in the spirit of the music that they're producing for the keyboard, that is, music that provides relief from cares and ingenious jesting with art, or the refreshment of your spirit. Now, this is a fairly slender thread of connections, but it's reinforced by 2 things that I would mention. First, the prominence of publishing the music in the first place. You might know, in Scarlatti's case, that he composed over 550 keyboard sonatas. He calls them all sonatas. A small subset of those are published in the esercizi. So that Scarlatti is composing a lot, but publishing only a very little. And the same is true of Bach. Most of Bach's music was never published. This project of publishing music in the 1730s and 1740s is something new, and it's something unusual for Bach as well as for Scarlatti. So simply the act of publishing music is to draw attention to what you're doing in a very unusual and very prominent way. So for this reason, it is quite likely that Bach and Scarlatti are very much aware of what the other is doing. And then the other connection between what Bach and Scarlatti are doing on the keyboard instruments lies in the way each one is writing for the harpsichord. And I'll mention 2 specific features. The broad feature of keyboard virtuosity. On the one hand, they are advertising relief from cares, refreshment of spirits. On the other hand, they're composing flashy, virtuosic music. And the further connection between the two composers and their published keyboard music lies in a particular kind of flashiness or virtuosity, and it is in hands crossing, that is, writing for the keyboard so that the player is crossing left hand over right or right hand over left. It makes a great visual impact, and it's a fun sort of refreshing, jesting thing that both composers are doing. So beyond Forkel's story of the origins of the Goldberg variations as pieces written for this servant, Goldberg, for his master, the Russian ambassador, we theorize also a kind of mutual inspiration game going on between two composers who never met, but were writing prolifically for the harpsichord, Bach and Domenico Scarlatti. Now, in the time remaining, I want to illustrate one further feature about the Goldberg variations that connects them to the other pieces on the program. If the other pieces on the program, because they are late 19th and early 20th century suite collections, if those other pieces on the program are backward looking, that is, they have a historical purview, I want to make the same argument for Bach, that Bach too is looking back at a tradition of keyboard composition. But in this case, he's not looking specifically at Scarlatti. That's a separate argument. In this case, he's looking at a specific piece that composers have been using as the source or the point of departure in sets of variations. So my point here is that Bach's Goldberg variations is, in a way, a set of variations on earlier variations. And I'll try to make that clearer with some sound examples. Now, Bach's variations is an aria, the actual tune or the theme, and then a series of 30 variations, as I mentioned. Now, when we think of a theme and variations, it's usually the tune that is altered in the series of variations. But in the Baroque era, variations used the bass line, so that the theme and variations in the Baroque era comes across as a series of what we would describe as ostinato variations, where the ostinato is a repeating bass line. Ostinato is the Italian word for stubborn. And that bass line stubbornly repeats throughout the piece with different music over top of it. That is the Baroque era approach to variations. So what Bach is doing is he is taking the same bass line used in earlier sets of variations and coming up with his own. So I want you to hear that because if for no other reason, to illustrate my point about what Bach is doing and how he's looking back over his shoulder and creating variations on variations, but also because to get the Goldberg variations, you need to focus on the bass line. Once you've got that, then you can really appreciate the variations above that bass line. That is, to hear the repeating bass line is to throw the variations above it into higher relief. So let me play you a few of these. I won't play them exactly in chronological order. I'll start with Henry Purcell. And in each case, I want you to listen to the bass line. And if you can see me in a corner of your screen, I'll just do a little miming so that to draw your attention to the movement of the bass line. Here goes. And if you don't hear anything, everybody write me an angry chat immediately so that I can fix whatever problem there is. But you should hear Purcell now. And I'll just fade that one out there. So what I was miming or dictating was the motion in the bass. And what the bass does is it goes down for the first half, and then it makes a cadential pattern for the second half. Let's hear the same bass line in a different set of variations by Handel. Got it. And for kicks, another one by Gottlieb Muffat. Here goes. Now, before getting to Bach, let me play you the Jean-Henri d'Anglebert. I saved this one for fourth because it's a little bit harder. It goes faster, and the rhythm of the bass line is different from the other examples, but it's still the same bass line. Here goes. Nope. Here goes. Okay, now, last thing then, Bach. And there are two things that I want to say. First, I've said already, same bass line. The thing that I haven't told you is, well, same bass line, but extended. Every example that I just played you is an 8-measure long bass line. 8 measures of 3/4 times. So you count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, up to 8, and that gives you the entire bass that's repeated in these ostinato variations. Bach spreads this out, or he adds on to it to give us a 32-measure long bass line. So I would like to think Bach is looking over the tradition of using this bass and deciding he's going to outdo everyone else just in the ostinato that he's using. So I'll let this go on for a little bit longer so that you can hear the extended bass itself. So what I played you was just the first half of the aria, and that was a total of 8 plus 8, 16. So the whole thing, the two halves of the aria, is going to be 32 bars long. So Bach is setting a high bar just in the ostinato, and just as a way of sort of overwhelming everyone with detail, here are the 30 variations. And the last problem that we've been working on in trying to sort out or understand his thinking in the organizing of these variations, what you're seeing here is a theory of how the variations form patterns. And the agreement among the scholars, and I'm listing the scholars in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, Ralph Kirkpatrick, David Schulenberg, and most recently, Peter Williams. Everybody agrees that there are patterns of 3 going on among the 30 variations. Where the disagreement lies is, well, where does the pattern begin, and what's the ordering within the pattern? And here I want to come back to the suite idea, because one of the defining features of the patterning is that you get a genre piece, as you do in the movements of a suite. You get a genre piece, then a hands crossing piece, and that's the link to Scarlatti, and then a canon. Now, the easiest thing for us to see is the sequence of canons. The first canon has imitation at the unison, that is just a repetition at the same pitch. Then the second canon is at the interval of a second, a small interval. And then the intervals of imitation get bigger and bigger so that you get the larger sense of progression through the 30 variations. Okay, that's the most obvious feature of patterning in the 30 variations. But then, since then, the theories we've been working on, or I should say Kirkpatrick, Schulenberg, and Williams, is what further details of patterning exist among these variations. So I'll leave it at that. The fact of genre pieces within these variations is what makes it such a nice fit to include some of the variations from the Goldberg variations with these suites. And that's the last thing that I wanted to say.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for your terrific insights as always. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this virtual pre-concert talk. Enjoy the concert tomorrow night. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, and bye-bye.